Hey, it's the casual elder playing the long game. Before we get into this one, I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you for the response to the first two videos in this series. The comments, the different perspectives, the disagreements, and the stories you guys have shared have added a lot to this conversation. And I genuinely appreciate everyone who's watched and contributed. Now, this is the third video in my State of the Game series, and so far we've uncovered two pieces of this story. In the first video, we looked at the money side. MCOC has way more ways to spend than ever, and yet the financial trends we found raised some interesting questions about where the game has been heading. Then in video 2, we looked at something completely different, the size of the game, how much MCOC asks us the player base to do, and how much it asks us to know, and whether more than a decade of constantly adding content, champions, and mechanics has simply become way too much. But I think there is something neither of those completely explains. Why does someone spend 5 years, 8 years, maybe 10 years building an account and eventually decide they've had enough? Because walking away from MCOC isn't like deleting a game you downloaded last week. For a long-term player, you're potentially walking away from years of investment. And the more I thought about that, the more I realized that there might be another piece to this story we haven't really explored yet, and that is trust. Because almost everything we do in MCOC requires it. So let's think about everything you invest into an MCOC account, whether it's your time, your money, units, rank up materials, signature stones, masteries, practice, champion knowledge, years of roster decisions, and sometimes even an emotional attachment to certain champions you've spent years playing. Every time I rank a champion, I'm making a decision based partly on what I believe that champion will be worth tomorrow. Every time I grind units for months and save them for an event, I'm trusting that the time I spent earning those units will be respected. Every time I learn a difficult fight, I'm trusting that the rules I'm learning will behave consistently. Every time I spend money, I'm trusting that what I'm buying has some reasonable value. MCOC doesn't require these investments for just 1 week. It asks of them over years. And I think that means the relationship between Kabam and the player depends on something that doesn't appear anywhere on your account screen. You have to trust the game enough to keep investing in it. And MCOC learned just how fragile that trust could be a long time ago. If you've been around long enough, you already know where I'm going with this. The 12.0 update. Back in 2017, Kabam made sweeping changes to combat and some of the most important champions in the game. And the reaction was huge. This wasn't simply players saying, I don't like the new meta. People had invested huge amounts of resources into MCOC based on what those champions did. Then the value proposition changed out of nowhere. The backlash became large enough that Kabam eventually issued compensation and rank down tickets, allowing players to recover resources from champions they no longer wanted ranked at the same level. And I think 12.0 left MCOC players with a lesson that extends far beyond the actual update. What I invest in today might not have the same value tomorrow. Now, games need balance changes, of course. Sometimes something genuinely is too strong and needs to change. I'm not arguing that Kabam should promise never to touch anything once it enters the game. But when progression requires scarce resources, time, and sometimes real hard money, changing what somebody already invested in creates a trust problem. And 12.0 wasn't the last time players would have to think about that. Investment trust is one thing, but there's another kind of trust that might be even more fundamental in a fighting game. When I press a button, does the game do what I told it to do? MCOC has had several periods where that basic relationship became a problem. There was the major overheating and performance crisis in 2018, for example. Then years later came something many players probably remember even more clearly: the parry dexterity input problems around 2021 and 2022. These weren't complaints about a champion being too strong or anything like that. Parry and dexterity are foundational mechanics. You build years of muscle memory around them. So when players started experiencing failed inputs and timing problems, suddenly you weren't always sure whether you made the mistake or the game did. Kabam acknowledged the problem. Compensation went on for an extended period of time, and Alliance Quest was temporarily made free. And eventually, Kabam developed the input system refactor as part of the effort to address the underlying system. And I think this matters for trust because compensation only addresses the resources you lost, but it doesn't immediately restore confidence in the fight itself. And in a game built around timing, once I start questioning whether the game registered what I did, something fundamentally has changed. Then Kabam eventually tried to formalize another problem. What happens when a new champion releases too strong or too weak? The Rebalance program was born. And it made sense on paper. Release a champion, collect data, watch how they perform, then decide whether adjustments are necessary. And from a game design perspective, I completely understand the logic. But from the player side, it introduced another question. Do I rank this champion now or do I wait? Because maybe I just opened somebody incredible. Maybe I spent catalysts on them, signature stones. Maybe I bought the crystals trying to get this specific champion. And now there's a period where I know Kabam might change what I acquired. That uncertainty matters in a game where resources can take months to accumulate. And eventually, Kabam ended the program. But what stood out to me was the language they used when explaining the change. They talked about wanting players to feel that their time and investments were fully respected. That is almost exactly the issue I'm talking about here. Because once players start hesitating because investing in something because um once players start hesitating before investing in something because they're waiting to see what Kabam does, you're already dealing with a trust problem. And one champion became perhaps the clearest example of why the rebalance program became so controversial. And of course, is none other than Serpent. Bam wasn't subtle about what Serpent was supposed to be. He was designed specifically as a punishing defender intended to make an impact in Battlegrounds and Alliance War. And he definitely did. The backlash around Serpent became so bad, and players complained about how many defensive tools were packed into one champion, how restrictive his counters felt, how much time he would waste, and how punishing he remained even when you understood what he was doing. Then came the rebalance review. This was exactly what the program was supposedly there for. Kabam looked at the data, they looked at the counters players were using, they looked at his performance, and their conclusion was essentially that Serpent had stabilized at a strong but healthy level. A large part of the community looked at that conclusion and said, seriously? And whether you agree with Kabam or the players isn't even the most interesting part to me. The interesting part is what Serpent represented, because Serpent didn't appear out of nowhere. After playing MCOC for 11 years, I think there is a progression in defender design that led us here. Now, I can't prove this was Kabam's deliberate strategy. I don't know what conversations happened internally. Maybe this is just part of what's supposed to happen. This is just my interpretation from watching the game evolve over time. But I think there is a pattern worth looking at. Now, let's go back years before Serpent. We had Domino, who was a menace at the beginning. Korg was also a very tough and unfair defender when he came out. Thing was the same way. And if you started playing much later, some of those names might sound almost funny to you. Korg or Thing? We fought those champions thousands of times. We know what to do now. Our rosters are filled with counters. But that's part of my point. They didn't change. We the player base did. A new defender would arrive and feel ridiculous. Players complained, then we learned the fight, counters came out, we ranked those counters, our rosters became stronger, and eventually yesterday's nightmare became normal. Then the line moved again. Kenny Parker arrives, Hulkling. Later we have Photon, Kindred, Onslaught, Maestro, Bullseye, then Serpent. And looking back, I feel like every generation of defenders makes the previous generation look more reasonable. Now, I want to make something very clear here. I cannot prove Kabam deliberately spent years asking, like, how far can we push the players before they complain? This is just my interpretation based on 11 years of playing and watching this game evolve. But I do think the progression itself is visible. And something happened along the way that made those kind of defenders far more valuable than they used to be. And that is none other than Battlegrounds. Now, Battlegrounds did not really invent difficult defenders, but I think Battlegrounds fundamentally changed what a difficult defender was worth. For example, in story content, if I need a specific counter, I'll bring that counter and that's it. However, in Battlegrounds, that's not enough. You need to have the counter on your account, first of all. The counter needs to be highly ranked and in your deck. Then it needs to survive bans. Then it needs to survive RNG to be able to draft it. Then I need to still have it available when the defender appears. And even if I have the correct counter, I don't simply need to win that fight. I need to win the fight quickly and with high health most of the time. That completely changes the value of restrictive defensive mechanics. A defender doesn't need to be impossible, they just need to waste 20 extra seconds, or force some damage, or require one of the 5 champions. Force me to use my best counter now so you can play something else later. And suddenly, defender design becomes part fighting game and part roster strategy. And I actually like that concept. Battlegrounds should reward roster depth. Drafting should matter. Champion knowledge should matter. The problem is where you draw the line, because eventually I think we have to ask, am I losing because I didn't play the fight or because I didn't draft the answer? And this is where I make a distinction between a hard defender and what I will call a roster check. Onslaught can be difficult. Photon was terrifying when she first came out, for example. Kindred caused problems, but over time, players learn those fights. You learn the special attacks, you learn the spacing, you understand the mechanics, you improve. That feels different to me from a defender where playing well still means taking unavoidable damage unless I bring a specific type of champion. Bullseye pushed in that direction. Serpent pushed much harder. Then we get champions like Dark Phoenix, the reworked Captain Britain, and others with restrictive mechanics damage, restrictive mechanics, damage caps, unavoidable damage, or highly specific answers. Again, difficult defenders should exist, don't get me wrong. I don't want every Battlegrounds fight to feel like I'm fighting Winter Soldier. The question is what kind of difficulty we're creating. Does this champion test whether I understand the fight, or does it test whether I can execute my skill level, or does it mostly test whether the correct counter exists in my deck? Because once enough players start feeling like the answer is the third one, another suspicion starts appearing. And this is where defender design starts colliding with trust. You've probably heard some version of this complaint before. Kabam creates the problem, then sells you the solution. I want to be extremely careful here because I have no evidence that Kabam sits in a meeting and says, well, guys, let's create an obnoxious defender so we can sell everybody the counter 3 months from now and make a lot of money. I'm not claiming that happens, but I understand why some players believe it. Powerful defender releases, and then their counters, because their counters are very limited, that defender becomes valuable in Battlegrounds and Alliance War. Then champions arrive with abilities that happen to answer those defensive mechanics. Dark Phoenix gives us an especially interesting example because access to her was tied to an event requiring enormous amount of units investment for guaranteed acquisition. then stronger answers to her followed. Does that prove Kabam intentionally created a problem and saw the solution? No. But here's where trust becomes important. If I trust the developer, I look at that sequence and think, maybe the meta evolved, and new counters came out. But if I don't trust the developer, I look at the exact same sequence and think, of course, they solved the problem, and now they're selling me the solution. Same events, completely different interpretation. Once players start thinking that way, intent almost becomes secondary. Because every new defender and every new counter gets viewed through suspicion. And champion design isn't the only place where this happens. Look at units. For years, around 15,000 units was a familiar number when players prepared for the major sales. You saved for July, you saved for Cyber Weekend. If you were free to play, that might mean months of arena. Then over time, the ceiling started moving. We get to 18,000 units, 30,000 units, 36,000 units, or 40,000 units or more, depending on the event and how far you want to go. Dark Phoenix became one of the clearest examples, with guaranteed acquisition requiring somewhere around high 30,000 unit range, depending on how you calculate the event resources. Now, Kabam has a legitimate counter argument here. Players earn more units than they used to. Kabam has said arena unit acquisition increased substantially over the years. So comparing 15,000 units years ago directly with 40,000 units today without accounting for increased unit income would be misleading. That's fair enough. But I think there's still a question worth asking. Did earning power increase enough to match spending expectations? Because uh, units represent two different things. If you buy them, units represent money. If you're someone like me who lives in arena, units represent time. Thousands and thousands of fights. So when the expected reserve for premium participation moved dramatically upward, the price isn't simply a bigger number on the screen. For some players, it's more money. For others, it's more hours of their life they have to grind arena. And when players already have trust concerns, every economic change starts getting interpreted different. I think revive farming demonstrates this perfectly. Kabam had a legitimate game design argument. Players were farming enormous numbers of revives from early story content and then using those stockpiles to brute force much harder endgame content. From Kabam's perspective, that undermined the intended difficulty and consumable economy. So they changed it and introduced the apothecary and a more controlled source as a more controlled source. I understand that argument, but many players looked at the same decision differently. Revives are resources. Resources have a unit value. Units have a dollar amount, have a dollar value as well. So when Kabam restricted an efficient way of earning those resources through gameplay, some players interpreted the motivation economically. Again, same decision, different interpretation depending on trust. And I think AI creates a similar problem from the mechanical side. Passive behavior, spatial baiting, reaction speed, intercepts, recovery. Those moments where the defender seems to react so quickly that you wonder what you were supposed to do differently. Kabam itself has acknowledged limitations with the existing AI system and has been working toward changing it. So I don't need to claim the AI is secretly cheating or anything like that. My concern is simpler. MCOC is fundamentally a fighting game. If I stop trusting that the fight behaves consistently enough for me to learn from my mistakes, then one of the most important relationships between player and game starts breaking down. Did I lose because I made a mistake, or did I misunderstand the mechanic, or did the AI behave strangely? Was there an input problem? Those questions matter because combat is the core product underneath everything else. Whether it's those times when you're just playing and it just feels like maybe you parried and it didn't quite work, or you were dexing, you got out of the way, but for some reason nothing, you didn't get out of the way fast enough, maybe, or you go to punish a special attack from the defender, and they parry you instead. Things like that always seem like, whether Kabam says it's not intended and they can't control the AI and they have nothing underneath, it's a code that is too complicated, or their answers aren't. It just always adds to this trust issues problem in MCOC. And this is where I think all of these seemingly separate controversies start connecting. 12.0, performance problems, the input crisis, the rebalance program, Serpent, restrictive defenders, revive farming, rising unit expectations, AI, the 2024 Banquet controversy, and of course, 7-star Ascension, which I believe deserves its own deep dive. Even newer questions around Twitch drops and Kabam giving selected creators access to rewards that could direct viewers toward their streams. These are different issues. Some were much more serious than others. Some had legitimate explanations. Some were reversed and some were fixed. And I want to make one distinction extremely clear. I cannot show you evidence that any of these controversies caused a meaningful number of players to quit MCOC. We don't have that data. Maybe some did, maybe some did not. But I think there is another way to look at their cumulative effect. And I call this trust debt. This is an official MCOC statistic. It's simply the framework I've started using to understand what might happen after years of controversies. One bad decision might not make me quit, for example. Neither does the next one or the one after that. But every time something happens, Kabam is asking me to give them the benefit of the doubt yet again. Maybe the input problem was unavoidable. Maybe that champion needed changing. Maybe revive farming genuinely was unhealthy for the game. Maybe that defender genuinely needed those mechanics. Maybe that event needed to cost that much. Maybe that AI behavior wasn't intentional as they claim. Each explanation might be completely reasonable on its own, but players don't experience these decisions in isolation. They remember. And I think every controversy potentially makes the next explanation a little harder to accept. Maybe players didn't leave because of one terrible update. Maybe every controversy made the next one harder to forgive. And if that's true, MCOC might have accumulated something far more difficult to repair than a bad reward structure or an overtuned champion. And that is trust debt. And that brings me back to where this State of the Game series started. Video 1 was about money. Video 2 was about how much MCOC asks players to do and know. This video was about whether years of controversial decisions changed the amount of trust players were willing to give the game. But while researching all of this, I kept noticing something. Money keeps appearing in the background. Revives have a unit value, counters have a unit value, champions have a unit value, rank up materials also have a value, major events ask for increasingly large unit reserves. Even some of the decisions players distrust most eventually collide with the economy of the game. And I think that creates one final distinction we need to investigate. There's a big difference between believing Kabam made a bad decision and believing Kabam had a financial reason to make that decision. Because once players start interpreting game design through monetization, every frustrating mechanic starts looking differently. Every restrictive defender, every new counter, every resource restriction, every progression system, every offer. Maybe that perception is fair, maybe parts of it are not. But after everything we've uncovered in these first 3 videos, I think it's something we have to investigate. So the next question in this State of the Game series is, did monetization make all of this worse? That's where we're going next. Thank you very much. If you liked what you heard, please like and subscribe. And if you did not, I still appreciate you for listening this long. And I'll see you in the next one. And remember, it's just a game.